This is Franklin Rye, and welcome back to Political Spirits, which still stands for the proposition that the left and the right should just have a few drinks and talk. We don't believe that there's any requirement that anyone should compromise, but rather we believe that for a democracy to work as intended, we must know what our fellow citizens think, and we should be free to talk about it without fear. Afterwards, we should be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. In the pilot episode, I talked about how identity politics can allow a party that takes advantage of it to basically ignore the needs of any demographic group within its coalition that it can convince that the other political party hates it. In the second episode, I talked about how we, unfortunately, can choose to live in a bubble, never exposed to competing opinions because of the proliferation of news and opinion sites available today. I used the example of the final speech of the Romanian dictator Nicolae Ceausescu to show an example of a preference cascade. When a population which has been exhibiting support for one policy or one leader because that is what it thinks it is supposed to do, even if that does not express its real beliefs, then suddenly realizes that its real beliefs have widespread support. In this case, Ceausescu probably had no idea what was coming, because his brutal policies prevented people from speaking their minds so that he didn't realize his regime had little support. As I noted, it is fundamentally destabilizing to a country to have its population operating under a widespread misunderstanding about what the people actually believe. In the case of Romania under Ceausescu, that was the result of the policies of the brutal regime which would imprison, torture, or kill anyone who expressed opposition to the dictator. I believe there are many examples of expressions of belief in America which are likewise stated, or actual beliefs held back and not expressed, not because some dictator is in charge, which is obviously not the case, but rather for fear that the actual beliefs would result in condemnation from those who are actually in substantial control of expression in America. Those who are in substantial control of expression in America are the left, in the form of the media, the educational institutions, especially at the collegiate level, the huge Silicon Valley companies which control the digital town square, and the online left, which has tremendous influence in driving claims of outrage to exact revenge on those who express beliefs which do not toe the politically correct line. I've watched for years as these elements of the left have secured scalps in the form of online sites which have been shut down, demonetized, or stripped of their advertisers, fearful of the angered left. Let's go back a few years. I think what really marked the start of the steamrolling of contrary thoughts by the left was the resignation of Brendan Eich as CEO of Mozilla, the maker of the Firefox browser, after he was the target of attacks, primarily on Twitter, when it was discovered that he had contributed $1,000 to the ballot initiative to define marriage in California as solely between a man and a woman. The initiative passed and was later overturned in court. When the fact that Brendan Eich had contributed to the initiative 6 years earlier was discovered, the response on Twitter was brutal. After the uprising of the Twitter mob, Eich resigned as CEO of Mozilla just a few days after he accepted the job. I read with great interest the article from the April 4, 2014 online edition of USA Today, which contains the statement, quote, "But Eich's abrupt departure stirred the debate over the fairness of forcing out a highly qualified technology executive over his personal views and a single campaign contribution 6 years ago." Close quote. Think about all the instances since 2014 when we have faced calls for boycotts or firings because of the political positions of public figures, including CEOs, and how often those calls have come from the left over a failure to toe the politically correct line. I really believe that the stunning success in just a matter of a few days, I suppose you could call it a success, of the left's effort to exact revenge on Brendan Eich energized what has been called the Twitter outrage mob, and it's been running full blast ever since then. The resignation of Brendan Eich was a watershed moment in American politics, when it became crystal clear to millions of Americans that there was a huge price to be paid for speaking their minds if their beliefs were politically incorrect. We all know that huge numbers of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. We all know that large numbers of successful American professionals have invested massive amounts of time and money in their education to advance their careers. We all know that massive numbers of Americans are parents who are committed to paying for or assisting their children with college educations that are extremely costly, to say the least. We all know that many Americans are tied to particular geographic locations because of extended family or children who cannot be relocated because of a spouse's job or a divorce. All of these are put at tremendous risk when politically incorrect expressions are made in the public square. All of these Americans can look to what happened to Brendan Ike and others when they think about what they say publicly. If a prominent CEO can lose his job in just a matter of days because of a political contribution, we all have to wonder what could happen to us. I believe this fear of retribution from the left impacts what Americans say publicly. Americans self-censor their thoughts expressed publicly and even in some semi-private conversations based on expectations set largely by the left. I believe that there is the potential for a preference cascade with regard to several issues of public policy import. I'm going to illustrate an example of one of these issues. It's certainly not the biggest, not the most important of the issues in terms of its impact on society, but it does tend to illustrate the extent to which Americans' views have been self-censored. That issue is the participation of transgender athletes in sporting events based on the sex with which they identify rather than the biological sex of their birth. I'm going to focus on participation by high school transgender athletes. The first thing to say about the issue is that nobody can dispute that those who suffer from gender dysphoria deserve our sympathy. I can't even imagine how difficult it must be to live a life when you believe that you are in essence in the wrong body. The extreme difficulty and trauma that must create is evidenced by the frighteningly high suicide and attempted suicide rates for transgender individuals. However, having sympathy for transgender individuals does not mean that we must adopt whatever position their interest groups espouse with regard to participation in activities including, for example, high school sports. The state I'm going to focus on is the state of Connecticut. It has adopted the position that transgender high school athletes can participate in sports based on the gender with which they identify. As a result, 2 transgender sprinters dominated the 100-meter finals, taking first and second in the 2018 state high school girls track and field championships, and the winner of the 100-meter final took first place in the 200-meter final as well. It isn't surprising that much of the media coverage of the event celebrated the accomplishment of the 2 transgender athletes and also made the point that the petition to change the rules, allowing participation based on the gender with which you identify rather than the gender of your birth, had a relatively small number of signatories as of the time when the articles ran. That approach is on par with the writings of the media on the left. What is surprising is that there has not been any publicity regarding any substantial buildup of support to change those rules. I believe the reason is fear of the reaction on the left. Nobody wants to be the next Brendan Ike. It's worth taking a moment to think about why we have girls and boys compete in separate classes based on gender to begin with. It isn't because of some Victorian notion about propriety or impropriety of boys and girls competing together. It is based on biological realities. As noted in LiveScience.com in an article dated May 27, 2017, quoting Dr. Emily Krause, a primary care sports medicine physician at Stanford Healthcare, quote, "Because women produce less testosterone, we are at a disadvantage in terms of muscle. Males have a greater amount of muscle bulk," close quote. She noted that a man's leg is about 80% muscle compared with about 60% for a woman's leg. She also noted that there are larger, fast-twitch muscle fibers in men, and those tend to help with sprinting. Among other aspects of the female body which place it at a disadvantage compared to men as to sprinting, she referenced body size, lung size, heart size, less hemoglobin in the blood, and the presence of estrogen, which tends to increase the percentage of body fat. The article also cites Dr. Miho Tanaka, an assistant professor of orthopedic surgery and director of the women's sports medicine program at Johns Hopkins Medicine. Tanaka referenced the fact that because women typically have wider hips than men, women are placed at a disadvantage in sprinting because of man's quadriceps are running in more of a straight line from the hips, whereas women's quads almost have to turn a corner between the hips and the knees. Tanaka didn't make this reference, but I point you to the woman who still holds the women's world's record in the 100-meter dash, Florence Griffith Joyner. One thing that always stood out about her was how narrow her hips were. She was a woman who naturally happened to have narrow hips. No doubt that helped her in running sprints, and that is, of course, different from someone who was biologically born a male and would therefore typically have narrower hips, from someone identifying as a female in high school and thereby be in a position to benefit from having narrower hips as a result of having been born of the male sex. Perhaps the biggest advantage for males when it comes to sprinting is the presence of testosterone. The Live Science article noted that by adulthood, some men have up to 20 times more testosterone than women do, according to Healthline. The article cites the Society of Endocrinology, which states that, quote, testosterone plays several roles, including telling the body to create new blood cells, keeping bones and muscles strong, and prompting growth spurts, close quote. I realize that we're talking about high school transgender athletes, but to understand the degree to which biologically female competitors are placed at a disadvantage when a transgender female who was born a male is allowed to compete against women in strength and speed events, think about what would have happened if then Bruce Jenner had announced in the mid-1970s that he identified as a female, and then Caitlyn Jenner had been allowed to compete in the 1976 Olympics in the women's pentathlon rather than the men's decathlon. What are the odds that Caitlyn Jenner would have been a runaway winner of the women's pentathlon? Is there any way that would be fair to the other competitors? There's an interesting aspect to the way Hall of Fame women's college basketball coach Pat Summitt used to train her teams at the University of Tennessee. She had a squad that was made up of college men who played basketball in high school, but not in college, and they would scrimmage against her women's teams on a regular basis to challenge them. By forcing her women's teams to go up against the generally stronger and faster men, she improved their game. Summitt generally picked male practice players between 5'8" and 6'2" to ensure they'd play below the rim, and she generally prohibited the men from being overly physical. Any debate about the comparative athleticism of male and female basketball players, even when the females are national champions, is put to rest when the late Pat Summitt, one of the greatest in history and a role model with few peers, said, quote, "It's a simple fact that guys, on the whole, are quicker, faster, and stronger." Close quote. Check the March 15, 1999 issue of Sports Illustrated for that quote. Now think about what Pat Summitt said. Think about what Caitlyn Jenner would have done in the 1976 Olympic pentathlon, and think about all the physical differences described in the LifeScience.com article that I quoted, and put it in the context of the high school female athletes who spent their entire careers in high school and beforehand practicing to win championships, only to come up against athletes who were born male but now identify as female. Those girls will be competing against transgender athletes who have developed for years with their bodies enjoying the athletic benefits brought on by testosterone in the male physique, including generally larger hearts, larger fast-twitch muscles, more hemoglobin in their blood, lower body fat percentages, and narrower hips. Could you blame those girls for feeling frustrated, like the rules have been stacked against them? Could you blame girls in the future in Connecticut if they chose not to compete in track and field because it felt like they had no shot to win it all because of the transgender competitors? Now think how strange it is in the context of Title IX that the left is lined up so consistently in favor of transgender athletes competing based on the gender with which they identify. Title IX prohibits discrimination in education programs and related activities based on sex. It was not limited to athletics alone, but has been generally considered to be primarily directed at equality of opportunity to participate in sports in any educational institution receiving federal funding. If girls do in fact stop pursuing some academic endeavors because they figure they'll face an uneven playing field in competing against transgender athletes, how unfortunate and ironic would it be that the left, which was so instrumental in passage of Title IX to begin with, would be instrumental in undermining its effectiveness. Do you see much talk about this issue in the press? Do you see much of a movement to push back against having transgender athletes competing against high school girls, for example? You don't. I think one of the reasons has to be because the parents who actually object, the sports fans who actually object, their friends who actually object, and the members of the general public who just think what is happening obviously doesn't make sense and who therefore actually object, don't want to be labeled transphobic. They don't want to be the next Brendan Ike. And that is a problem for us all. Next topic. Movies and political correctness. As you know, I'm a fan of the movies. So let's talk about where Hollywood is missing out. I'm not going to talk about Hollywood stars bad-mouthing half the country. Let's save that for another episode. Instead, let's talk about the fact that movies with the same left-wing politically correct messages and plot lines keep getting made over and over again. I've lost track of the number of left-wing movies that have been made about the Iraq War, and virtually every one of them is tanked at the box office. The list of box office failures includes Rendition, Stop Loss, Green Zone, Body of Lies, and Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk. All ranged from underperforming at the box office to being actual box office bombs. The one Iraq War movie which was a major financial success was American Sniper, and it had the highest box office of all time for a war film. It was the top-grossing movie in the U.S. in 2014. To understand just how successful it was, think about the films it beat out at the box office, including The Hunger Games Mockingjay Part 1, Guardians of the Galaxy, Captain America Winter Soldier, and X-Men Days of Future Past. At a time when it seems the only really big box office performers are superhero movies, American Sniper stood out by bucking the trend. How did it do it? Well, the website QZ.com points out that, quote, much of its success is owed to how well it did in America's South and Midwest, two regions that historically don't really boost box office numbers for major Hollywood films, close quote. The article also notes that the movie did play well, quote, across all areas and political parties in the U.S., close quote. The article didn't take the analysis much further, but I think we should. The movie industry is one which is under tremendous threat. When you can sit at home and watch a film on a 60-inch, 70-inch, or even 80-inch screen, pause the action when you want to respond to a text message or check the score on a game or go to the bathroom or heat up some pizza rolls, Hot Pockets, or any other artery-clogging mixture from the kitchens of Union Carbide, you can do it without having to rush back into the movie theater because the film kept running. When facing that kind of competition, the last thing any industry should do is ignore two major regions of the country. The fact that American Sniper was a cash cow in the South and the Midwest should have been a clue to every funding source in Hollywood that the way to make a movie not involving superheroes that will still make big money is to hit on subjects which are near and dear to the hearts of those in the South and the Midwest without being so hardcore right that they completely turn off those in the urban areas of the East and West. Did Hollywood learn that lesson? Did it take that clue? Not that I can see. In fact, sometimes it seems that Hollywood isn't in the business of making money, but rather it's in the business of impressing its friends. It seems sometimes that the producers of Hollywood films just want to get awards to be able to say that they got them, to give some credibility to themselves at events and Hollywood parties, rather than to produce a return for investors. Given that aspect of the way Hollywood conducts itself, I frankly wonder how they ever get any investors to support production of films. How many times have you read an article talking about how Hollywood is out of ideas? It seems to constantly be remaking films, often recently doing nothing more than taking the same movie that's been previously made and redoing it with an all-female cast, usually with disastrous financial results. It's amazing that such creative laziness brings anybody into the theater at all. I can only think of 2 films that I saw in the last few years that were very good and that stepped outside of the Hollywood norm of presenting things from a politically correct left-wing perspective. One of those films was Kingsman: Secret Service. Given that it's been out for 3 years, and a not nearly as good sequel has already been released, I'm going to talk about the details of the film under the assumption that if you were going to see it, you would have already done so. The film deals with a delinquent being taken under his wing by a spy in a private spy agency run by extremely wealthy, patriotic Brits. That aspect of the film is not at all new and different. Think My Fair Lady and Trading Places, for example. What is extremely different about the film is its villain, played by Samuel L. Jackson. The villain, Richmond Valentine, is a tech billionaire who decides he'll address global warming by eliminating the vast majority of the world's population by activating a cell phone chip which spurs extreme violent conduct by billions of people around the world, thus killing multitudes. The only people who will be able to survive are the wealthy and aristocratic elites who've accepted Valentine's offer to join with him. By depicting wealthy elites attempting to address global warming as hypocritical participants in mass murder, rather than individuals worthy of our admiration, the movie is definitely outside of the Hollywood norm. That it also depicts a delinquent orphan as someone who needs to buck up and start behaving like a gentleman, rather than someone who needs to be coddled because he was given a lesser lot in life, it places itself even further outside the Hollywood norm. Then, when the arrogant elites who try to kill off the bulk of the world's population while saving themselves in Valentine's underground lair, instead have all of their heads explode in multicolored choreography that looks like a blending of a 4th of July fireworks show and an Esther Williams water ballet, or synchronized swimming to those of you who've never seen an Esther Williams water ballet, I was absolutely blown away. Instead of the movie somehow finding a way to applaud the elites proudly virtue signaling that they were saving the planet from global warming, they went up in a series of explosions that the lead character Eggsy correctly described as spectacular. Wow. Kingsman's Secret Service made $414 million at the box office on a production budget of $81 million. That'll do. The other movie that I saw in the last few years that was very good and that stepped outside of the Hollywood norm of presenting things from a politically correct left-wing perspective was Hell or High Water. The film was released in 2016 and starred Chris Pine, Ben Foster, and Jeff Bridges. It dealt with a pair of brothers trying to avoid the loss of their deceased mother's home by resorting to bank robbery. The film seemed particularly relevant because it was depicting the collapse of small-town America as experienced in the Texas countryside at the same time that Donald Trump was campaigning around the country, rally after rally, contending that he could turn around that collapse. That struggle would not normally be something that you would think of as outside of the Hollywood norm, but in the context of the 2016 election, it was. Moreover, the film included a scene which could be described as pro-gun or anti-gun control. Specifically, when the brothers are robbing a bank, one of the customers manages to message friends on her cell phone that the bank is being robbed. When the robbers emerge from the bank, they're greeted by a hail of gunfire from the locals, who've all lined up behind their vehicles to fire at them with their personal weapons. That produces the best line in the film, as they jump in their getaway vehicle. Quote, "These concealed carry permits sure complicate a bank robbery, don't they?" Close quote. That comes remarkably close to a pro-Second Amendment message, at least by Hollywood standards. Hell or High Water ended up with a box office gross of nearly $38 million. You might say, well, that's not that much, but the production budget for the film was only $12 million. If you recall the point I made in the pilot episode podcast that in my view, Rotten Tomatoes ratings get artificially inflated for films that present certain hot-button issues from a politically correct left-wing perspective, and get artificially deflated when they present hot-button issues from a more right-of-center perspective, you might think to yourself, well, Hell or High Water proves me wrong. The film had a Rotten Tomatoes rating of 97%. How can my theory about the impact on the ratings of films with a left or right-leaning perspective be correct if Hell or High Water is a right-leaning film, especially a pro-Second Amendment film, with a 97% Rotten Tomatoes score? I have two responses to that. First of all, Hell or High Water isn't just a good movie, it's a great movie. Moreover, it doesn't present issues from any single perspective. Sure, it can be interpreted as I do, as having a pro-Second Amendment message. However, the fact that the customer in the last bank who tries to take out robbers with his own pistol actually gets killed fits with the message of gun control advocates that those who attempt to defend themselves are more likely to be shot instead. Furthermore, there's an overriding theme throughout the movie that the dire financial straits experienced by small towns in Texas is the result of the efforts of the banking industry to take advantage of the poor. That is a decidedly left-wing message. What I'm saying is that the movie has something in it for both the left and the right. Those who think that Texas exemplifies rugged American individualism and self-reliance can point to the film. Those who think that reliance on individual gun ownership is foolish can also point to the film. Those who think that modern society has ignored the needs of rural and small-town America, in other words, the most loyal core of the Trump electorate, can point to the film. But so can those who believe that banks are at the heart of America's problems. In other words, the film has something in it for everyone. If Hollywood really wanted to make money by making films other than superhero films, which would interest broad swaths of the American public while excluding nobody, it should look to Hell or High Water for the recipe. Let's hope that my recipe for a podcast is one that you enjoy. I'm looking forward to serving up the next order of political spirits next week. Until then, this is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.